I never thought I'd come home to find strangers swimming in pools built on my grandmother's grave. But that's exactly what happened on a muggy Tuesday morning in August, when I pulled my dusty Ford pickup around the bend of what used to be my driveway. The sight hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Where my farmhouse should have been standing proud against the morning sky, where my wheat fields used to wave golden in the breeze, now stood rows of identical white houses with sparkling blue pools, manicured lawns, and iron gates that screamed, "Keep out," in polite suburban language. I sat there for a full minute, engine idling, wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. But no, there was old Miller's oak tree, still standing sentinel at what used to be my property line. There was the bend in Creek Road that I'd driven 10,000 times. This was my land, or it had been, 37 days ago when I'd left for Chicago to settle my brother's estate. 37 days. That's all it took for my entire life to vanish like smoke. A uniformed security guard approached my truck, clipboard in hand, looking every inch the petty bureaucrat drunk on borrowed authority. He was maybe 25, soft around the middle, with the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself very seriously indeed. "Sir, this is a private community. Do you have business here?" His tone carried that particular brand of condescension, reserved for people who drive old trucks and don't look like they belong in suburbia. "Business?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, I've got business. I live here. Or I did." I gestured toward the collection of cookie-cutter houses. "This is my property. My name is Tom Richardson, and every square inch of this development is sitting on land that's been in my family for 60 years. The guard's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed amusement. He actually smiled, like I'd just told him the world's funniest joke. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. This is Sterling Hills Community, owned and operated by the Homeowner Association. If you don't have proper documentation proving residence, you need to leave the premises immediately." That's when she appeared, as if summoned by the scent of conflict. Karen Whitmore emerged from the largest house at the end of the cul-de-sac, striding toward us with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. She was a woman built for commanding attention, broad-shouldered and imperious, wearing a white tennis outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that swished with each aggressive step, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Is there a problem here, Marcus?" she asked the guard, though her eyes never left mine. There was something predatory in her gaze, like a cat that had cornered a particularly interesting mouse. "This gentleman claims he owns the property, Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus replied, emphasizing the word gentleman like it was a punchline. Karen's laugh was bright and musical, and absolutely vicious. "Oh my goodness, you must be the previous owner. How wonderful that you've stopped by to see what we've done with the place." She gestured grandly at the development behind her. "I hope you approve of the improvements. We've really brought this area into the 21st century, don't you think?" The casual way she said "previous owner" made my blood run cold. Previous nothing. I own this land. I have the deed, the tax records, everything. I've been paying taxes on this property since my father died in 1987. What I want to know is how the hell you people built houses on my land without my permission. Karen's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, holding it out to me like a peace offering. "Oh, you poor man. I can see there's been some confusion. Everything was handled completely legally, I assure you. The property was sold at auction for unpaid taxes while you were away, all very above board. The county required proper notification, of course, but when no one responded," she shrugged elegantly, "well, life moves on, doesn't it?" I took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside were official-looking documents, stamped and notarized, declaring the property seized for non-payment of taxes and sold to Sterling Hills Development, LLC. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine. It wasn't even close. "This is fraud," I said quietly, but my voice carried across the pristine street like thunder. "That's not my signature. I've never missed a tax payment in my life." "Oh dear," Karen said, and now her voice dripped with false sympathy. "I'm afraid the county disagrees, but please, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're reasonable people here. I'm sure we can work something out. Perhaps a small apartment in town. I know the landlord at Sunset Manor, and they have some lovely efficiency units for people in your situation." My situation, like I was some charity case, some homeless vagrant who'd wandered onto her perfectly manicured paradise by mistake. I looked around at the houses, at the families starting to emerge from their front doors to watch the show, at the children pointing and whispering. In 37 days, they would build a community on the bones of my life, and now they were treating me like an intruder. "You want to know something funny?" I said, folding the fraudulent documents and tucking them into my shirt pocket. "My wife is buried under what's now your tennis court. My father built his workshop where your house sits. 3 generations of my family worked this soil, and you people waltzed in here and paved over our history like it never mattered." For just a moment, Karen's composure slipped. I saw something flicker across her face. Maybe guilt, maybe just annoyance at having her morning disrupted. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Well," she said briskly, "that's all very sentimental, but sentiment doesn't trump legal documentation. Marcus, I think Mr." She paused expectantly. "Richardson." "Mr. Richardson needs to be escorted off the property. We can't have unverified individuals disturbing our residence." That's when I noticed June Pemberton standing in the doorway of the house that now occupied the spot where my kitchen used to be. June, who'd been my wife's best friend. June, who'd cried at Sarah's funeral and promised to look after the place while I was gone. June, who was now looking at me like I was a stranger. "June," I called out. "June, it's Tom Richardson. Tell them who I am." She stepped back into her house and closed the door without a word. The sound of that door closing was like the final nail in a coffin I didn't even know I was building. I stood there in the middle of what used to be my driveway, surrounded by houses full of people who didn't know my name or care about my history, and felt something inside me break clean in half. Not anger, not yet. Just a deep, hollow emptiness, like someone had scooped out my insides and left me standing there like a scarecrow. Marcus was speaking into his radio, probably calling for backup. Karen was watching me with the satisfied expression of someone who just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. And June Pemberton, who'd sat at my kitchen table 1,000 times, who had helped Sarah plant the roses that were now buried under asphalt, had just erased 30 years of friendship with the click of a lock. "Sir," Marcus said, his hand resting meaningfully on his belt where a taser hung like a promise, "I'm going to have to insist you leave now." I looked around one more time, memorizing the layout of this strange new world that had sprouted from my roots. Then I climbed back into my truck, cranked the engine, and drove away. But as I reached the end of the street, I caught Karen's reflection in my rearview mirror. She was still standing there, watching me go, and she was smiling. That smile told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I drove straight to the county courthouse, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. The fraudulent documents Karen had given me were burning a hole in my shirt pocket, but I needed to see the originals before I made my next move. The courthouse was one of those imposing brick buildings that looked like it had been there since the Civil War, all columns and marble steps designed to make ordinary citizens feel small. Today, it just made me feel angry. The clerk in the tax assessor's office was a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like she'd been filing papers since the Carter administration. When I explained what I needed, she disappeared into the back room and returned with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Here we go, Mr. Richardson. Property tax records for the last 5 years, and the foreclosure documentation from this summer." My heart sank as I flipped through the papers. There it was, all official and stamped. Notice of tax delinquency, dated 6 months ago. Notice of pending foreclosure, dated 4 months ago. Notice of public auction, dated 2 months ago. all sent to my correct address, all showing 0 payment received. The problem was, I'd never received a single one of them. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest, "I never got any of these notices, and I've never missed a tax payment, ever." She peered at me over her glasses with the patient expression of someone who'd heard every sob story in the book. "Sir, our records show these were all mailed to your registered address. If you didn't receive them, you'll need to take that up with the Postal Service." But I was already thinking about Vince Kowalski, my mail carrier for the past 15 years. Vince, who'd always been reliable as sunrise, who knew everyone on his route by name. Vince, who'd had a lot of gambling debts lately and had been asking around town about quick ways to make money. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways I didn't like. I spent the rest of the morning at the courthouse, photocopying everything I could get my hands on. The auction record showed that Sterling Hills Development LLC had bought my property for exactly the amount of the supposed back taxes plus fees. No competing bids, no publicity, no notification to neighbors who might have wondered why Tom Richardson's farm was being sold off. It was clean, efficient, and completely illegal. By the time I got back to town, word had already spread. That's the thing about small communities. News travels faster than wildfire, and apparently the story of crazy Tom Richardson trying to reclaim his stolen land was the best entertainment they'd had all year. I stopped at Murphy's General Store for coffee and supplies, and the conversations died the moment I walked through the door. Bill Murphy himself emerged from behind the counter, a big man with kind eyes who'd been selling me hardware and feed for 20 years. "Tom," he said quietly, "I heard about your troubles up at Sterling Hills. I want you to know, nobody here believes that garbage about you not paying your taxes." "Thanks, Bill," I said, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, could hear it in the way his voice carried just a little too far, like he was performing for the other customers rather than talking to me. That's when Jake Martinez walked in. Jake was maybe 30, an artist type who'd moved to town a couple years back looking for cheap rent and inspiration. He had paint under his fingernails and wore his hair longer than most folks around here were comfortable with. But he'd always struck me as decent. He nodded at me, then approached the counter where I was paying for my coffee. "Mr. Richardson," he said quietly, "I'm renting the old Garrett place up on the hill overlooking your property. Was your property, I mean." He glanced around nervously. "I've been watching what's happening up there. If you need someone to witness what you've seen, what's been done to your land, I'm willing to testify to that." It was the first offer of help I'd gotten all day, and it hit me harder than I expected. "I appreciate that, son. I really do." "There's something else," Jake continued, lowering his voice even further. "I found some things in the old barn on your property before they tore it down. Personal stuff, family photos, documents. I saved what I could." He pressed a crumpled paper bag into my hands. Inside were treasures I'd thought were lost forever. My father's Purple Heart, Sarah's jewelry box, our wedding photos, and a stack of letters Sarah had written to me during my deployment in Vietnam. Seeing her handwriting again, after all these months, was like getting punched in the chest by a ghost. "They were just throwing it all away," Jake said, his voice tight with anger. "Like it was garbage. I couldn't let that happen." I had to step outside before I embarrassed myself by crying in front of the whole store. The afternoon sun was brutal, but it felt good on my face, clean and honest in a way that nothing else had been lately. I sat in my truck for a long time, holding Sarah's letters, remembering the young man who'd received them 50 years ago. That man had been so sure of his place in the world, so confident that right and wrong were clear, distinct things that never blended together. That evening, I drove back out to Sterling Hills, parking just outside the gates, where I couldn't be accused of trespassing. I wanted to see my land, to try to understand how it had been transformed so completely in such a short time. The development was impressive, I had to admit. The houses were well built, the landscaping professionally done. If this had been anyone else's land, I might even have admired it. But it wasn't anyone else's land, it was mine. Every tree they had cut down, every foundation they had poured, Every blade of grass they'd planted was a violation of something sacred. I could see lights coming on in the windows, families settling in for dinner, children playing in yards that covered the graves of my ancestors. The casual normalcy of it was somehow the worst part. That's when I noticed June Pemberton walking her little terrier along the pristine sidewalks. She saw my truck and hesitated, then changed direction and approached the fence. For a moment, neither of us said anything. "Tom," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry about this morning. I was scared." "Got scared of what, June? It's me. You've known me since Sarah and I got married." She glanced back toward her house, where I could see a figure watching from the window. "They told us you'd sold the land yourself, said you'd taken the money and run off, then come back trying to cause trouble when you'd spent it all." She paused, studying my face in the fading light. "But looking at you now, seeing how much pain you're in, I don't think that's true." "It's not true," I said simply. "They stole my land, June, forged documents, intercepted my mail, bought off whoever they needed to buy off. And now they're counting on everyone believing their story instead of mine." She was quiet for a long time, wrestling with something internal. Finally, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital camera. "Karen asked me to take some pictures of you today. Said it was for security purposes, to document any incidents you might cause." She handed the camera through the fence. "But I think you should see what I actually recorded." I scrolled through the photos on the tiny screen, and what I saw made my blood boil. Karen had staged the whole thing. There were pictures of her briefing Marcus before I'd even arrived, shots of her positioning herself for maximum dramatic effect, even a photo of her practicing her concerned citizen expression in her hallway mirror. The woman had turned my homecoming into performance art. "She's been planning this for weeks," June said quietly. "Ever since she heard you were coming back. She told everyone you were mentally unstable, that losing your wife had broken something in you, said you might be dangerous." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not just Karen's calculated cruelty, but the realization that my entire community had been willing to believe I was capable of abandoning my responsibilities, my history, my very identity. That they'd found it easier to accept Karen's lies than to question why a man who'd never caused trouble in his life would suddenly become a threat. "Why are you telling me this, June?" She looked back at her house again, where the watching figure had moved to a different window. "Because Sarah was my friend, and because what they did to her grave, what they built over it without even acknowledging what was there before. It's not right. It's not Christian." As I drove home that night, Sarah's letters on the seat beside me and June's camera evidence burning in my pocket, I felt something shifting inside my chest. The hollow emptiness was filling up with something harder, something with teeth. For the first time since I'd driven around that bend and seen strangers living on my land, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could fight back. But first, I needed to understand exactly who I was fighting. And I had a feeling that Karen Whitmore was just the pretty face on something much bigger and uglier than simple greed. The next morning, I woke up with a plan that would have made my old Army sergeant proud. It was devious, it was risky, and it was probably the only chance I had to reclaim what was mine without spending the next 5 years in court battles I couldn't afford. The key was understanding Karen's greatest weakness, her need to be seen as the perfect suburban's queen. The woman who'd transformed a worthless farm into a prestigious community. I started by calling my nephew Danny, who worked in Chicago doing something with computers that I'd never quite understood. "Danny, I need you to create something for me, a website, but make it look official, government-looking." I explained what I needed, and after a long pause, he agreed to help. "Uncle Tom, this is either brilliant or completely insane." "Probably both, son. Probably both." While Danny worked his digital magic, I spent the day in town, quietly spreading a very specific kind of information. I told Bill Murphy that I'd heard rumors about environmental problems at Sterling Hills, mentioned to the barber that someone had told me there might be issues with the water table, suggested to old Mrs. Patterson at the post office that perhaps the county hadn't done proper soil testing before approving the development. Small towns run on whispers and speculation, and by evening, half the county was buzzing with concern about potential problems at the fancy new development. The beauty of it was, I wasn't lying. I genuinely didn't know if there were environmental issues. I was just asking questions, the kind of questions that should have been asked before anyone built houses on farmland that had been treated with pesticides and fertilizers for 60 years. The second part of my plan required Jake's help. That evening, we met at his rented house, and I showed him what Danny had created, an official-looking website for something called the Regional Environmental Protection Initiative, complete with government seals and forms for reporting suspected contamination. It looked so authentic that for a moment, I almost believed it myself. Jake, I need you to print out some official notices from this site. Make them look like they came from the State Environmental Agency. Nothing false, mind you, just inquiries, questions about soil testing, water quality assessments, that sort of thing. Jake stared at the screen, then at me. Mr. Richardson, this is forgery. This could get us both arrested. No, I said carefully. Forgery is creating fake documents to deceive people. This is creating real questions about real issues that should have been addressed months ago. The difference is, we're going to tell Karen exactly what we're doing. The next morning, I drove back to Sterling Hills with a folder full of Jake's printed notices and a heart full of righteous fury. Karen was in her front yard, directing a landscaping crew with the authority of a general commanding troops. She saw me coming, and her face tightened with annoyance. Mr. Richardson, I thought we'd settled this yesterday. You're not welcome here. Oh, I'm not here to cause trouble, Karen. I'm here to help. I handed her the folder with a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. See, I've been worried about all these nice families living on land that might not be safe. Farmland can have all sorts of contamination issues. Pesticide residue, fertilizer runoff, buried chemical containers from the old days. I'd hate for anyone to get sick. She flipped through the official-looking documents, her face growing paler with each page. These are from the State Environmental Agency. Inquiry forms, I agreed. See, I called them yesterday, expressed my concerns as a former landowner. They're very interested in making sure proper testing was done before residential construction began. Apparently, there's supposed to be a mandatory soil safety assessment for any agricultural land converted to housing. Did the Homeowner Association handle that paperwork? The landscaping crew had stopped working and was listening intently. I could see other residents emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Karen's perfect composure was starting to crack around the edges. Of course we handled all the proper paperwork, she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Everything was done according to regulations. Oh, good, I said, pulling out my phone. Then you won't mind if I call the environmental agency right now and confirm that all the testing was completed. They said they'd be happy to verify the safety certifications for concerned citizens. Now she looked genuinely panicked. That's not necessary. I'll have our legal team handle any inquiries. Legal team? I made sure my voice carried to the growing crowd of neighbors. Karen, if the land is safe and all the proper testing was done, why would you need lawyers? These folks just want to know their families aren't living on contaminated soil. That's when Marcus the security guard approached, hand on his radio. Mrs. Whitmore, should I call this in as harassment? Harassment? I laughed, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm trying to protect these people's health and safety. If asking questions about environmental testing is harassment, then every concerned citizen in America is a criminal. A woman I didn't recognize stepped forward from the crowd. What kind of contamination are we talking about? She asked, and I could hear real fear in her voice. Well, I said, warming to my audience, pesticides can cause cancer, birth defects, neurological problems. Fertilizer runoff can contaminate groundwater, cause kidney damage, and if there are any buried chemical containers from the old days, well, You don't want to know what that can do to property values. The crowd was growing, and the questions were coming faster now. Were our houses tested for this? What about our children? Why weren't we told about potential risks? Karen was trying to maintain control, but you could see the panic in her eyes as her perfect community began to fracture around her. Everyone needs to calm down, she said, but her voice was shrill now, desperate. This man is obviously disturbed. He's making wild accusations because he's bitter about losing his property. That's when June Pemberton stepped forward, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Courage. Karen, she said quietly, if you're so confident about the safety testing, why don't you just show us the reports? Put everyone's minds at ease. I don't have to show anyone anything, Karen snapped. This is private property, and you people are residents, not owners. The Homeowner Association handles all legal matters. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. The crowd turned ugly fast, residents demanding answers, threatening to withhold their monthly fees, talking about contacting real environmental agencies and real lawyers. Karen's authority was evaporating like morning mist, and she knew it. That's when I played my final card. You know what, folks? I think I've been approaching this all wrong. Karen's right. This is your community now, and you deserve to know the truth about what you're living on. So, let me make you all a deal. I turned to address the crowd directly, ignoring Karen completely. I'm going to pay for independent environmental testing of this entire development. Soil samples, water quality, air purity, the whole works. And when the results come back, we'll know for sure whether this land is safe for your families. The crowd erupted in approval. Karen looked like she'd been struck by lightning. You can't do that, she sputtered. You don't have access to this property. Actually, said Jake, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd with a folder of his own, he can. State law allows former property owners to request environmental testing if there are legitimate concerns about contamination, especially if the current development was built without proper safety assessments. I could see the exact moment when Karen realized she'd lost. Her face went through a series of expressions: rage, panic, calculation, and finally a kind of defeated exhaustion. The perfect suburban queen was crumbling, and her subjects were watching it happen. Fine, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Fine. You want to test the soil? Test it. But when it comes back clean, I want you gone, permanently. I nodded solemnly. Fair enough, and if it comes back showing contamination, well, I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But here's the thing about small-town justice. Sometimes it's not about winning or losing. It's about truth finally having its day in court. Over the next week, as we waited for the test results, the residents of Sterling Hills began asking harder questions about the rushed construction timeline, about the lack of community input on the development, about why they'd never been given proper disclosure about the land's agricultural history. The environmental tests came back clean, of course. I'd never really expected them to show contamination, but by then, it didn't matter. Karen's authority was broken, the residents had formed their own committee to investigate the Homeowner Association's practices, and 3 families had already put their houses up for sale rather than deal with the uncertainty. On a quiet Thursday morning, Karen Whitmore knocked on the door of my rented room in town. She looked older somehow, diminished. You win, she said simply. What do you want? I want what was always mine, I told her, but I'll settle for what's right. In the end, we made a deal. The Homeowner Association would purchase a small plot at the corner of the development, just big enough for a proper memorial garden where Sarah's grave had been. They'd maintain it in perpetuity, with a bronze plaque acknowledging the land's history and the families who'd worked it for generations. In exchange, I would publicly endorse the environmental safety of Sterling Hills and stop asking inconvenient questions about soil contamination. It wasn't everything. It wasn't my farm back, wasn't my house rebuilt, wasn't my life restored, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was respect for the dead and recognition of the past. And sometimes, that's the best kind of victory you can hope for. I still drive out there sometimes to sit in that little memorial garden and talk to Sarah about the changes in the world. The residents nod to me now when they see me, some with respect, some with curiosity, a few with genuine friendship. June Pemberton brings me coffee occasionally, and Jake Martinez painted a beautiful portrait of the farm as it used to be, which hangs in the community center. Karen moved away 6 months later, selling her house at a loss and taking a job in some distant city where nobody knew her story. The new Homeowner Association president is a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, who actually listens when people talk and doesn't treat every conversation like a power struggle. It's not the ending I would have chosen, but it's the ending that was possible. And maybe that's enough. Maybe learning to live with enough instead of demanding everything is part of what growing older really means. I've got my memories, I've got my dignity, and I've got a place where Sarah's memory is honored. Some battles are worth fighting not because you can win them completely, but because fighting them changes you into the person you need to be. And sometimes that person is someone who can find peace in a small garden where the past and present finally learn to coexist.